Welcome to this podcast episode in my podcast series around vertical development. In today's episode, I'm going to look into the catalyst leadership stage. So in the previous episodes, I've covered the expert stage, which is the first one. Then I covered the achiever, and today is the catalyst. And the following two will be the co-creator and the alchemist as the highest leadership stage. But before I go into the catalyst leadership characteristics, I just want you to pause for a sec and think about a good leader or leaders you have had in the past that really motivated you and inspired you to become a better leader yourself. Try to think about that person and how they acted. And then as I run through the catalyst leadership stage and what really characterizes a leader operating in that stage, see if there are things that resemble that leader you had in the past. So let's look into the catalyst leader. First, it has to be mentioned that, like in the football analogy, all leadership stages build on the previous one. So you don't go from the third division to the first division without going through different stages. And as you grow through the different stages, you acquire new capacities and you become wider in your toolbox as a leader and can make use of different sets of approaches to handle different sets of situations. So all the capacities that the expert developed and all the capacities that the achiever developed are part of the toolbox of a catalyst leader as well. The difference is that when you operate at the catalyst level, you will have a preference for using the capacities and approaches that you develop at that stage compared to the previous ones. But there will be times where you would make use of approaches that are more characteristic for instance, an achiever and still be a catalyst leader, but you may find it more useful to make use of other sets of leading compared to some of the new capacities that you are gaining when you reach the catalyst level. At the catalyst level, you gain two new capacities. So one of them is the ability to make compelling visions. I'll come back to the visions a little bit later. And the second one is the participation, i.e. to begin to see a wider range of people and how they can influence the results you're trying to create. Both areas will be covered throughout the session. So if you look at the catalyst leader, to go back to the analogy with the camera, I mentioned that the expert had a tendency to have like a zoom. They zoom in on a task. The achiever have the capacity to zoom out, get a wider understanding of what's happening, begin to see some stakeholders, begin to understand complexity in a new way, and also begin to see the person that they are working with or having as an employee, beginning to develop the person and not just the task that the person is working on. When you reach the catalyst stage, you as a leader begin to have a wide angle lens. So now it's not only zoom and zoom out, it's also wide angle. You begin to see more. And that covers both how the stakeholders are being perceived. So you begin to understand that different stakeholders may have very different views and different ways of thinking and reasons for doing so. And it also includes getting wider. It can be environmentally, how do I make something that is more lasting? What is the bigger purpose and so on? So the wide angle lens really becomes wide in many different aspects. Another area that really changes when you reach the catalyst stage is your self-reflective capacity. So where the expert could appreciate that other people have different behaviors and some people may be moody, some people may be very energized and so on, they didn't necessarily think so much around the underlying drivers of it. The achiever began to understand that they are driven by different factors in themselves, be it to some extent their own upbringing, their own moods. They begin to recognize things in themselves on a more reoccurring basis. When you reach the catalyst level, you really begin to understand all the underlying drivers in yourself. So as the catalyst stage is also a stage that evolves, in the early parts of being in that stage, you're probably only beginning to understand how your own background, your social, economic background, your childhood, the country you grew up in, and all those different factors have made who you are today. And you also begin to understand how all these factors on a daily basis actually impacts how you see things, how you react to things, and so on. It's still in a stage where you only begin to understand it, so you're not able to control it and manage it necessarily, but you begin to understand that some of your behaviors may be rooted in how you were brought up. Your handling of, for instance, senior managers may be rooted in how you have seen authority since a childhood, and so on. So a lot of these things becomes visible for you, and you begin to see it in a very different light, because just the observance of it in yourself and the awareness of it helps you cope with it in a very different way. And that also makes you more effective when you begin to lead. You manage situations in a new way, and also conflicts in a more constructive way, because you begin to understand what's kind of driving yourself in different situations. And with that deeper reflective capacity, your empathy also deepens. So where you at the achiever stage, for instance, could relate to how other people would react. So you may see and observe a situation and you think, I would react in the same way, or I would react in a different way. And you can get a sense of how they probably would feel. You don't have the deep feeling of how it must be to be that person. That evolves when you get to the catalyst level, because you only understand other people to the level you understand yourself. And at the catalyst level, you really begin to understand the underlying drivers, for instance, based on your background, your upbringing, your cultural class, your society, the country you come from, and so on. But because you begin to get all these different elements clearer in your own mind, you also begin to understand that other people will have it in the similar way, but just from a different angle. So your ability to put yourself in other people's shoes and not only think how they would react, but think how they may feel, evolves. And that is something that really differs, because suddenly you can empathize with people and not necessarily just sympathize with people. This deeper understanding of the biases that we all have based on our background and our upbringing and so on also means that the catalyst leader in general are much more curious to other people. They're curious to understand where other people are coming from. They seek input from other people. They know that because other people will see things differently, people can contribute with different perspectives that they may not have thought about themselves. So in that sense, they are much more inclusive and seeking input from more people. And that comes back to the participation part. Catalysts will also typically use that seeking input from others to grow themselves. So they're more curious as to how they come across, how their ideas may sound like, and so on. So they are much more feedback seeking in an effort to improve and develop themselves as human beings. Throughout the stages, the self-awareness constantly gets deeper and deeper. At the catalyst level, where it's beginning to get fairly deep, you begin to understand what is the underlying driver that drives you. What is the shadow sides that are kind of nagging inside you. We all have a positive and a negative way of seeing ourselves. Sometimes we're overly negative upon ourselves. Other times we can be overly positive and exaggerate how good we are at things. That begins to become clear at the catalyst stage. So a catalyst leader begins to understand how they are colored by different things, but also underlying drivers like ways of thinking about things that impacts how they react to things. So that deeper self-awareness really begins to understand, or begins to help them understand, who am I as a leader and what is it that really drives me in different situations. The combination of the deeper self-awareness and empathy enables a catalyst leader to put themselves in other people's shoes, in the sense that they can try on frames. So imagine you have a situation with 3 people. You may be one part and you have 2 others. Then they have the capacity to try to put themselves in a one person's chair and think how they must feel. How is it all looking from that angle? What is the thought process, and why may they think in a certain way? And then from another, and then from their own. And that way they become better at managing different situations because they can put themselves in a different seat and in that way try to understand, for instance, the problem from more angles than just listening from input from other people. It also enables them to begin to see solutions in a very new way. So it's not only the compromise that has developed at the achiever stage, where you can have a compromise or a fairly good solution or not so good solution, but it's still on the continuum from a bad to a good outcome, or the compromise in the middle. You begin to understand that actually there can be many different angles of a problem. So what I thought may have been a compromise actually can be a very different solution, because suddenly you see it from new angles, and hence you also see the solution field in a very different angle. That also means that they understand their stakeholders better. So that stakeholder development that you see the achiever develop, where they begin to see much more types of stakeholders. What happens at the catalyst stage is that a catalyst leader understands these stakeholders in a very different way, because the catalyst can put themselves in the situation of the different stakeholders and try to understand and feel how it must be to be that stakeholder or that stakeholder. Hence, they manage their stakeholders in a very different way because they empathize with them. This combination of the deeper reflective capacity and empathy that both helps a catalyst leader try on frames and understand how other stakeholders or people may feel and act, also helps them better coping with what is happening in a life situation. So for instance, where the expert can relate to a situation after, think about that it didn't go well, and it was probably because of A, B, and C. The reflective capacity upon one's own behavior is fairly limited at the expert stage. At the achiever stage, it evolves into being a reflective capacity that can look into, for instance, you've had a bad meeting, and on the way back from work in the tube or in the car or whatever transport you're having, you may reflect upon what happened, what did I contribute with? So I becomes part of that equation. So they begin to think, what could I have done differently? If I had done it this way or that way, what would the outcome have been? But it's still taking place after. When you reach the catalyst stage, you at times momentarily can, in the presence or in the present situation, actually decode the situation and reflect upon your own behavior. So imagine you are making a presentation in front of a larger audience and you have 20 slides. And you begin to sense that when you're talking, people are not really liking what you're saying, or they are beginning to feel it's too long and so on. Then you can decode the audience and reflect upon your own behavior and, for instance, speed up or change or scrap your entire presentation and begin to talk freely instead, because you react upon the situation. Another could be that you are having a very heated discussion in a senior leadership meeting, and everyone is getting very emotional, and you may actually observe that you are very emotional yourself, and you may pause, and you may even make everyone aware that the atmosphere is a bit tense here. Am I the only one who is recognizing this? And that could in itself change the entire direction of the meeting, because suddenly everyone becomes aware that actually this is a very tense situation. How do we come away from that? So that capacity to live change a situation by observing what's happening, observing what are you contributing with yourself, and hence change your own contribution to try to get another outcome, is something that begins to come at the catalyst stage. It's still early, so at this stage it's only momentarily. It's not something that a catalyst leader can do all the time, but at times it will hit them and they will have this capacity. Another area that really differs for the catalyst leader, again building on the deeper self-reflective capacity, the empathy, the framing and all of that, is understanding of culture. And here I'm not talking about culture like I have a Danish culture and there is an American culture, a British culture, a Nigerian culture, and a culture from every country around the world. We all have different cultural traits. But here I'm talking about corporate culture. What kind of culture is actually in an organization? And with culture, I'm meaning what is the behavior. So culture is how is a group behaving in an organization. So behind the culture, you have individual behavior. And behind that individual behavior, you have a mindset. What mindset is driving a given behavior that then leads to the culture? So a catalyst leader have the ability to read between the lines, sense what is happening, get a feeling of what kind of culture am I actually operating in. That becomes very important when you especially lead an organization through change, because if you don't understand the culture and what really forms that culture, you can have a huge struggle implementing a larger change in an organization. To give you an example, you may have an organization saying we are very learning oriented and we really support people taking initiatives, but that may be what you're saying on the interact and that is what you are articulating in paper. But what is really happening in that organization may be that everyone who has failed historically has been punished. Either their career has leveled out or they have had an exit route. You may talk about how Brian made a huge failure maybe 5 years ago, and that conversation still is ongoing in the organization. And you may be promoting all the people who is playing it safe and never the ones who take initiatives and try to think out of the box. So the culture in such an organization is actually everything but learning oriented, everything but open-minded, is actually giving a very different impression. So you can argue that a mindset in such an organization is that they may say it's learning oriented, but the mindset is keep it safe, otherwise you will risk your career. That leads to a behavior that keeps it safe and everyone is playing by the rules to think about their own career. And then that becomes the culture of the organization. And then you may actually have the kind of the system holding the culture locked, and that may be who gets promoted, who's getting the big salaries, who's getting the big bonuses, who's on an exit strategy, who is actually being impacted by the organization in which ways. So a catalyst leader will have an understanding of all these different factors and think it in when they, for instance, lead an organization. They are also at a stage where they understand that, for instance, leading a organizational change, for instance, a cultural change, cannot be led by HR. So some managers will ask HR to change the culture. HR is very capable of doing many things, but they are not in a position to change a culture, because a culture comes from the top team and it filters down through the organization. And because a catalyst is very aware of this, they will take lead in changing the culture themselves. But if you are not in a position where you're very senior and you're a catalyst leader at a more junior level, you can only change so much within your own part of the organization and maybe the neighboring part, because you may act as a role model. But to really change a culture in an organization, you have to have the senior managers leading by doing, because people, they observe, they don't read what to do. So if an organization say that we're very learning oriented, you need to have a top management demonstrating visibly that they appreciate people who maybe at times take chances and fail, but then you learn from it. So that is where it really differs between an achiever leader and a catalyst leader. That is that profound understanding of the different dynamics around culture. And this leads into the two additional capacities that I mentioned earlier. So the first one is the visioning. With all these things combined, the ability to understand others, understanding culture, understanding people, empathize, all these things, and also the interest in people in making a difference, makes the catalyst leader much better at creating visions. So where the expert don't really have the capacity to make visions, they are more doing a strategy plan for the next year. The achiever can make visions maybe 5 years, maybe longer, but in general not the long horizon visions, and not necessarily so motivational vision, but a vision for an organization. The catalyst, with all these softer skills, make visions that are really thought through and also speaks to the heart. So they have visions that can be much far further reaching, and it may be visions that may change an organization much more and much more radically than you would see at the achiever stage. They also have an ability, because the vision will have been created with a dear interest from themselves, to be able to deliver it in a very compelling way. So people get inspired, people want to follow them, they can really understand why this vision makes sense. And then the other part around the participation I also touched upon. So when a catalyst wants to create a vision, they typically would also include more people in the visioning project. So they may have the overall horizon where to go there, but instead of going into a boardroom with their top team and a handful of consultants for a couple of months and work out a new vision and how it should be implemented, an approach from a catalyst could be to include maybe the 40 most important employees in an organization. And that would not only include senior managers, it may also just be people who have been there for many years, who have a good thing or have a very good network and have a lot to bring to the decision making, and people who may have a different perspective and still be seen as someone who can have a huge influence in the organization. By including all these different people in a group, what the catalyst then achieves is that they get a lot of perspectives, because they are very aware of the different biases and views that everyone will have. So not only do they get a better solution, because the solution will be catered for a lot of different views and thought processes, they also get a very different commitment. And that commitment comes from the fact that if you've been part of creating something yourself, you will also have a very different commitment in rolling it out subsequently. So where the one leader who will go to his boardroom or her boardroom and develop a solution with a lot of consultants in a closed room, and then come out and then try to get more managers on board, and then try to get the entire organization. Typically they use maybe 3 months on the strategy. The top team gets 2 or 3 days in an offsite, and then the rest of the organization get a 3-hour presentation, and I expected to understand where the top team is, which are like 6 months ahead of the curve. In this catalyst way of thinking, it will be very different, because you will have a very big group of the organization being part of forming and shaping the vision, and especially how it should be implemented. And then you have so many committed stakeholders suddenly helping implement it in the organization, that the implementation subsequently is a very, very different project compared to the former. When it comes to drive and motivation, I've covered how the drive for a expert leader is to deliver the task. That becomes kind of the imperative that they really seek to deliver. When you reach the achiever stage, it's around delivering a result, being part of delivering something bigger. That may be the year-end result or a major project or something like that. When you get to the catalyst stage, it builds on the achiever, that the result still is very important, but it widens. So it's not only the result, it's also making a organization that is thriving, that is fun to work in, where people develop, where people are enjoying being. So the purpose becomes wider than just the result. It's around filling in between the results, also the space around making it nice to be there, work there, enjoyable, and so forth. So it's a wider motivation that drives the catalyst leader. When it comes to the area of feedback and personal development, at the expert stage, it's very much around beating yourself up. An expert is not good at taking in the feedback and would very often be very unreasonably hard on themselves. When you get to the achiever stage, it's more being disappointed. Why didn't I do that? How can I do that better next time, and so on. But it's a milder version and more constructive, and also an ability to seek feedback. When you get to the catalyst stage, it becomes much more affirming. So the catalyst is beginning to understand themselves much better, their underlying drivers, their behaviors, their biases, and so on. So they begin to understand the complexity of themselves. And they also begin to understand that they may have some thought processes that are impacting them on a daily basis. That may actually be that they are still seeking approval from others, that they crave to get that acceptance in different ways, and when they don't get it, then they get disappointed. But as they begin to understand that they still have those needs that they may have thought they put behind them a long time ago, they also begin to become much more affirming and begin to understand that the way to cope with this is to actually accept that I don't need other people's, for instance, other people's approval or praising of me, but to find a more peace inside yourself. And that new affirming approach enables the catalyst to develop in a very different way, because they are not anymore becoming dependent on other people's input, but empower themselves to take ownership of their own development and find peace with their own development and the direction that they are seeking. You can't control other people, you can only control yourself. So taking that from being dependent on other people's appreciation of you to find the appreciation in yourself is really an empowerment that strengthens the development strength of the catalyst leader. So to sum up, catalysts are the first leadership stage that really is fit for holding senior positions, especially in a very dynamic or complex organization. So the expert have a lot of limitations around time and understanding stakeholders and so forth. So they typically are better at managing a function or a limited area. The achiever has the capacities around understanding time dimension, i.e. past, present, and future, understanding stakeholders in a wider context, beginning to make visions for an organization, beginning to understand how the political dynamic exists in an organization, and so on. All those capacities were developed at the achiever stage and enables an achiever to hold a senior position. But where the difference is that when you get to the catalyst stage, the ability to understand the culture in the organization as well. What culture is actually driving this organization, and does it need to be changed? How is people thinking? The engagement, getting more people on board for instance, a change or transformation. The participation part. The ability to see more far or further reaching visions for an organization, really rooted in a deeper purpose, and also having the ability to deliver it so people are really getting motivated. The understanding around stakeholders in a much deeper level due to their deeper empathy and their self-reflexive capacity helps them understand the complexity with which they are operating in a very, very different way. So in many ways, the catalyst leader is the first leadership stage that really can drive complex transformations of an organization, because they have a lot of the right elements that are needed to really deliver outstanding results and transformation. And when I'm talking about transformation, I'm not talking a change from A to B. I'm talking about a transformation where an organization is moving from some kind of an organization to a different type of organization. The reason why I ask you to reflect upon good managers in the past and what it was that really made them good, and hold it up against yourself, is that it can become a very good guidance for you, where you could benefit from developing, and because you have sensed in yourself how big impact it can have on you when a certain manager operates at a given stage and have some capacities, it can be an inspiration for you to try to acquire and develop those capacities in yourself. I hope you found this podcast episode around the catalyst interesting. If you have any thoughts or reflections, do leave them in the commentary field below. Otherwise, I do hope to see you in the next podcast, where I will look into what characterizes a leader operating at the co-creator level. All the best for now. Bye-bye.